The altimeter read 17,000 feet when the first shell struck. Flight Lieutenant James Andrew Watson felt the impact through his boots, through the control column, through every rivet in the Lancaster bomber's fuselage. It was 21 minutes past midnight on April 28, 1944, and above occupied France, the darkness had just turned deadly. The Junkers 88 night fighter came from below and behind, exactly where Watson's mid-upper gunner couldn't see it. 20mm cannon shells tore into the Lancaster's starboard inner engine. Within 30 seconds, the wing was burning. Watson pushed the control column forward, trying to sideslip the massive aircraft, trying to keep the flames away from the fuel tanks, away from the wing route, away from his crew. 7 men depended on him. 4 were Canadian, like Watson himself. 3 were Royal Air Force. They had flown together for months, trusted each other completely, and now they were on fire, over enemy territory with the Alps rising somewhere in the darkness below them. This was Mission 16 for Watson. He was 21 years old, the oldest man aboard, and he had perhaps 2 minutes to make a decision that would save 6 lives and cost him his own. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Lancaster bomber was never supposed to be over France that night. The target was Friedrichshafen, Germany, a lakeside industrial city on the Bodensee, where the Luftwaffe built its fighters and the Kriegsmarine constructed its U-boats. 323 aircraft had been dispatched from bases across eastern England, 18 Lancasters from 622 Squadron alone. The mission planners expected losses. They always did. But they also expected results. And in April of 1944, with invasion preparations reaching their crescendo, every bomb that fell on German industrial capacity mattered. Watson's Lancaster, registration RND 781-G, had taken off from Mildenhall in Suffolk at 2100 hours. The aircraft carried 14,000 pounds of high-explosive ordnance in its bomb bay. Its 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, each producing 1,600 horsepower, had lifted the 30-ton machine into the spring night without difficulty. Everything about the flight had been routine until they crossed into enemy airspace. Then the night fighters found them. The Luftwaffe's defense network was sophisticated by 1944. Radar stations tracked the incoming bomber stream. Ground controllers vectored fighter aircraft toward intercept positions. The Junkers 88 night fighters carried their own airborne radar sets and, crucially, upward-firing cannons mounted at an angle behind the cockpit. These Schräger Musik installations, as the Germans called them, allowed fighters to clown, approach from below where most bombers had no defensive guns, position themselves directly beneath the target, and fire upward into the unprotected belly. Watson's aircraft was attacked in exactly this manner. His rear gunner, Flight Sergeant Murdoch McKinnon from Cape Breton, never saw the fighter coming. The first indication of danger was the sound of cannon fire and the immediate bright flash as shells penetrated the Lancaster's aluminum skin. The bomber's defensive response was immediate but ineffective. Watson threw the aircraft into a corkscrew maneuver, a violent series of diving turns designed to throw off the attacker's aim. Mid-upper gunner Ron Hayes called out directions, watching tracers arc through the darkness, trying to anticipate where the next attack would come from. But the German pilot was skilled and persistent. He closed again, this time from 350 meters, and his aim was devastatingly accurate. The starboard inner engine took multiple hits. Fuel lines ruptured. Within seconds, flames were spreading along the wing. Watson could see the fire reflected in his instruments, could feel the aircraft losing stability as the wing's aerodynamics changed. He reached for the fire extinguisher controls. Nothing happened. The system had been damaged in the attack. The fire continued to spread. Every bomber pilot trained for this scenario, but training could not replicate the reality. The Lancaster's wing held thousands of pounds of high-octane aviation fuel. If the fire reached the main tanks, the aircraft would explode. Watson had perhaps 90 seconds before that happened. The proper procedure was clear. Ring the abandon aircraft bell, order the crew to bail out. Follow them through the escape hatches. Hope the parachutes opened. Hope you came down in friendly territory, or at least somewhere you might evade capture. But Watson faced a problem that training had not fully addressed. The Lancaster was not a stable platform with one engine out and a wing on fire. It wanted to roll into the dead engine, wanted to enter a spin, wanted to become uncontrollable. If Watson left his position, even for the few seconds it would take to reach an escape hatch, the aircraft would become a death trap for anyone still inside. His navigator would be trying to determine their position so crew members would know where they were bailing out. His bomb aimer would be moving from the nose compartment toward the forward escape hatch. His wireless operator would be destroying the radio set and gathering his equipment. His flight engineer would be helping prepare for bailout. All of this took time, and Watson needed to give them that time. He made his choice in the span of a heartbeat. He would fly the aircraft for as long as physically possible. He would keep it stable while his crew escaped, and he would not follow them out. The decision Flight Lieutenant Watson made above France was shaped by doctrine that had been written in blood over 3 years of strategic bombing campaign. The men who flew Lancaster bombers in 1944 were products of a system that had learned, painfully and expensively, how to wage industrial warfare from the air. Royal Air Force Bomber Command had begun the war with theories about strategic bombing that reality quickly shattered. Pre-war doctrine assumed that bomber formations could defend themselves with machine gun fire, that they could navigate accurately to targets using standard navigation techniques, and that precision bombing would cripple specific industrial facilities. All of these assumptions proved false when tested against German air defences. By 1944, the bomber offensive had evolved into something far more brutal and far more effective than pre-war planners had imagined. The Lancaster bomber itself represented this evolution. It was not the first heavy bomber Britain fielded, nor was it originally designed for the role it eventually filled. But it fairly I know their redesign WWII became the most capable platform for carrying large bomb loads deep into enemy territory and, crucially, for bringing its crew home alive when things went wrong. The Lancaster's 7-man crew reflected careful thinking about task specialization under combat conditions. The pilot, like Watson, commanded the aircraft and made all tactical decisions. The flight engineer monitored systems and assisted with engine management. The navigator determined position and directed the pilot toward the target. The bomb aimer operated the bombing equipment during the attack run. The wireless operator maintained communications and operated radar warning equipment. The 3 gunners, positioned in nose, mid-upper, and rear turrets, defended against fighter attack. This crew structure was designed for mutual dependence. Every man had a specific role. Every role was essential. And the system worked only if every member trusted every other member completely. Watson's crew had flown together since training. They knew each other's voices, habits, capabilities. This familiarity was not accidental. Bomber Command deliberately kept crews together because experienced crews survived longer than new crews, and surviving crews gained more experience, creating a positive feedback loop that benefited everyone. But the system contained an inherent tension. In an emergency requiring bailout, the pilot's responsibilities created a terrible dilemma. He needed to keep the aircraft controllable, while crew members moved to escape hatches, fastened their parachutes, and jumped. This required him to remain at the controls longer than anyone else. If the aircraft became uncontrollable before he could reach an escape hatch, he would die. Every pilot knew this. Every crew knew their pilot might face this choice. And in 1944, with heavy losses continuing month after month, everyone involved had seen aircraft spiral down in flames with someone still trapped inside. The psychological preparation for this scenario was minimal because command structure could not officially acknowledge it. To tell pilots they might need to sacrifice themselves to save their crews would undermine morale and might encourage premature bailouts. To ignore the possibility would leave men unprepared for the moment of decision. The solution was informal. Senior pilots talked to junior pilots. Experienced crews discussed possibilities with newer crews. Men learned what might be required of them through stories about other men who had faced the choice and made it. Watson knew these stories. He had arrived at 622 Squadron in February of 1944 as a replacement pilot. The squadron had been operating since August of the previous year and had already lost multiple aircraft. Watson flew his first operational mission on February 14th. By late April, he had completed 15 missions, enough to be considered experienced but not yet enough to be truly veteran. He understood the odds. He understood what might be required. The broader context of April 1944 gave these individual decisions strategic significance. The Allied invasion of northwestern Europe was scheduled for early June. Bomber Command's mission was to prepare the ground for that invasion by destroying German industrial capacity, disrupting transportation networks, and drawing Luftwaffe fighters into battles of attrition where they could be destroyed. Every mission mattered. Every bomb that hit its target mattered. Every bomber that returned safely could fly again tomorrow, and every crew member who survived could pass their experience to newer crews. This strategic picture existed far above Watson's immediate concerns as he fought to control his burning Lancaster, but it shaped the calculus of his decision nonetheless. If he abandoned the aircraft immediately, he might save himself. If he stayed with the aircraft to give his crew time to escape, he would almost certainly die. But his crew members, if they survived, represented thousands of hours of training, months of operational experience, and future missions they could fly with replacement pilots. The arithmetic was brutal but clear. Watson had been taught, through official channels and unofficial conversations, that in certain circumstances, the mathematics of war required individual sacrifice for collective survival. He had been given a moral framework that made such sacrifice not just acceptable but honourable. And now, with flames spreading along his wing and his crew preparing to bail out, he had approximately 60 seconds to prove whether he believed what he had been taught. The Lancaster continued its descent through the darkness above occupied France. The fire grew brighter, and Watson held the control column steady while his crew moved toward the escape hatches. Flight Lieutenant Watson's path to the burning Lancaster above France had begun 18 months earlier in Hamilton, Ontario. He had been 19 years old when he enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force, one of thousands of young men drawn by the promise of serving in the most technologically advanced branch of military service. The selection process was rigorous. Physical examinations tested eyesight, reflexes, coordination. Written tests assessed mathematical ability, spatial reasoning, mechanical comprehension. Psychological evaluations attempted to determine which candidates possessed the temperament for sustained operations under extreme stress. Watson passed every examination. He was commissioned as a pilot officer and sent to elementary flying training school, where he learned basic aircraft handling in Tiger Moths, small fabric-covered biplanes that were forgiving of student errors. He progressed to service flying training on twin-engine aircraft, learning to manage multiple engines, to navigate by dead reckoning and celestial observation, to fly on instruments when visibility disappeared. Throughout this process, instructors evaluated not just his technical skills, but his judgment under pressure and his ability to command a crew. The training pipeline moved Watson across multiple bases, each specialization building on previous foundations. He learned bombing procedures, radio communications protocols, emergency procedures for engine failures and electrical fires. He flew night navigation exercises that simulated the conditions he would face over enemy territory. And critically, he learned crew coordination, how to integrate the actions of 7 men into a single functional unit capable of finding a target in darkness, attacking it accurately, and returning home safely. By the time Watson arrived at 622 Squadron in February of 1944, he had accumulated approximately 200 hours of flight time. This was substantial by training standards, but minimal compared to what combat would demand. His first operational mission was flown as second pilot, with an experienced crew, a standard procedure that allowed new pilots to observe actual combat conditions before assuming command responsibilities. The mission targeted Berlin. Watson saw searchlights probing the night sky, watched flak bursts bracket nearby aircraft, witnessed bombers going down in flames. The experience was educational in ways that no training exercise could replicate. His own crew came together through the standard crewing up process. The Royal Air Force and Royal Canadian Air Force did not assign crews administratively. Instead, Aircrew members at operational training units were turned loose in a hangar and told to form their own crews. This system, which appeared chaotic to outside observers, actually worked remarkably well. Men sought others with compatible temperaments and complementary skills. Pilots looked for navigators who inspired confidence. Gunners sought pilots who demonstrated calm under pressure. Within days, 7-man crews formed naturally, and these self-selected teams generally performed better than administratively assigned groups. Watson's crew consisted of Flying Officer William Ransom as navigator, a fellow Hamilton native. Flight Sergeant Roy Clive Eames served as flight engineer, responsible for monitoring engine performance and fuel consumption. The bomb aimer was Pilot Officer William McKee. Wireless operator was Flight Sergeant John Wilson. The 3 gunners were Sergeant Dennis Turnbull in the nose turret, Ron Hayes in the mid-upper position, and Murdoch Mackinnon in the rear turret. 4 Canadians, 3 British, all volunteers, all trained to the same high standard. They flew their first mission together on February 20th, 1944. Target: Stuttgart, a major industrial centre in southwestern Germany. The mission lasted 7 hours. They encountered heavy flak over the target but returned without serious damage. This pattern continued through subsequent missions. Leipzig on February 24th, Schweinfurt on February 25th, Augsburg on February 26th. Each mission added experience, built confidence, reinforced the crew's trust in one another. By April, they had completed 15 operations together. They understood each other's communication patterns, could anticipate actions under various circumstances, knew who would remain calm when situations deteriorated. This mutual knowledge was not simply beneficial, it was essential for survival. Combat flying demanded instant responses to rapidly changing situations. Crews that communicated effectively survived. Crews that hesitated or misunderstood each other died. The mission to Friedrichshafen on April 27th was Watson's 16th operation as aircraft captain. The briefing that afternoon detailed the target's importance. The Zeppelin works at Friedrichshafen produced radar equipment for the Luftwaffe. The Maybach facility manufactured engines for German tanks. The Dornier factory built the bombers. Destroying these facilities would directly support the coming invasion. The intelligence officer displayed reconnaissance photographs, showing the industrial complexes laid out along the northern shore of the Bodensee. The meteorological officer predicted good visibility over the target but possible cloud over France during the return flight. Watson's Lancaster was loaded with 14,000 pounds of ordnance, 4,000-pound high-explosive bombs, 4 1,000-pound bombs, and 6 500-pound bombs. The fuel tanks were filled to capacity, providing enough range to reach the target and return with adequate reserve for landing delays. The crew completed their pre-flight checks in the late afternoon light. Watson tested the controls, confirmed engine response, verified that all instruments showed normal readings. By 2100 hours, the Lancaster was airborne, climbing eastward toward the target area. The outbound flight proceeded without incident until they approached the turning point 30 minutes from the target. Then the Junkers 88 found them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first indication of attack was cannon fire from below. Flight Sergeant McKinnon in the rear turret had no warning. The German fighter had approached from the blind spot beneath the Lancaster's fuselage, using its upward-firing cannons to deadly effect. The shells that struck the starboard inner engine were 20mm high-explosive rounds, each one carrying enough energy to tear through aluminum skin and destroy complex machinery. Watson's response was immediate and exactly as trained. He threw the Lancaster into a corkscrew maneuver, rolling the aircraft into a steep diving turn to the left, then reversing to climb and turn right, then diving left again. This violent maneuvering was designed to present a restoration, constantly changing target to the attacking fighter, making accurate aim impossible. Mid-upper gunner Ron Hayes called out positions, trying to spot the attacker in the darkness. His voice over the intercom was calm despite the circumstances. Direction 350, range closing, lost visual, coming around again. The German pilot was experienced. He stayed with the Lancaster through its evasive maneuvers, positioned himself for another attack, and fired again from 350 meters. More shells struck the starboard side. This time the damage was catastrophic. The starboard inner engine's fuel lines ruptured. Aviation fuel sprayed across the hot engine components. Ignition was instantaneous. Within seconds, flames were visible, streaming back from the engine cowling. Watson reached for the fire extinguisher controls for that engine. He pulled the handle, directing the chemical suppressant into the engine compartment. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the fire extinguisher system failed. Damaged by the cannon shells, it could not deliver suppressant to the burning engine. The flames continued to spread. Flight engineer Eames confirmed what Watson already knew: fire extinguisher not responding. Fire spreading to wing structure. Fuel feed shut off, but residual fuel burning. The wing itself was beginning to burn, not just the engine. The Lancaster's wing was constructed of aluminum alloy formers and stringers, covered with aluminum skin, all of it held together with rivets and structural adhesive. At high temperatures, the adhesive failed, and the aluminum softened. Once the wing structure began failing, the aircraft would break apart. Watson had perhaps 2 minutes before structural failure made the aircraft uncontrollable. He made his decision instantly. He called for the navigator to determine their position. Flying Officer Ransom calculated quickly. They were approximately on the French border, somewhere over Alsace. Not friendly territory, but not deep in Germany either. Any crew member who successfully bailed out and evaded capture might eventually reach Allied lines. Watson gave the order over the intercom. Prepare to abandon aircraft, collect parachutes, move to escape hatches. His voice remained steady. There was no panic in his tone, no uncertainty. The crew responded with the efficiency of men who had trained for this scenario and trusted their commander completely. But Watson also made a second decision, one he did not announce over the intercom. He would remain at the controls to keep the aircraft stable while his crew escaped. The Lancaster, with one engine out and a wing on fire, wanted to roll into the dead engine. Left alone, it would enter a spin within seconds. Men trying to reach escape hatches in a spinning aircraft had virtually no chance of survival. Watson needed to maintain control, keep the wings level, prevent the spin. This required his constant attention to the control column. He began a technique called side-slipping. By applying opposite rudder and aileron, he could make the aircraft fly slightly sideways through the air. This moved the flames away from the wing route, away from the fuel tanks, buying precious seconds. But the maneuver also increased drag and accelerated the descent. The Lancaster was losing altitude at approximately 1,000 feet per minute. From 17,000 feet, that gave the crew 17 minutes, if the wing structure held. Behind Watson, his crew moved through their abandonment procedures. Ransom gathered his navigation equipment and moved toward the forward escape hatch. McKee prepared the nose escape hatch. Wilson destroyed the radio set, smashing the crystals so the equipment could not be used by the Germans if captured. Eames helped the gunners exit their turrets. Each turret required specific procedures. The nose gunner could exit easily. The mid-upper gunner had to rotate his turret to a specific position before he could climb out. The rear gunner, McKinnon, had to rotate his turret beam on to the aircraft, then crawl forward through a narrow space. Watson monitored their progress through brief status reports over the intercom. Navigator clear, bomb aimer at forward hatch, wireless operator preparing to jump. Throughout this time, Watson maintained control of the aircraft. His hands on the control column made constant small corrections, compensating for the changing weight distribution as crew members moved through the fuselage, adjusting for the increasing drag from the fire, countering the aircraft's tendency to roll. The flames grew brighter. Watson could see them reflected in his instruments, could feel heat beginning to penetrate the cockpit. Flight engineer Eames appeared beside him. Eames understood immediately what Watson intended to do. The pilot would not be following them out. Eames spoke briefly, words that were not recorded but that Watson acknowledged with a nod. Then Eames moved to the forward escape. hatch and jumped into the darkness. 5 men had now escaped. McKinnon was still fighting to get out of the rear turret. The turret had been damaged by cannon fire, its rotation mechanism jammed. McKinnon struggled with the manual override, trying to force the turret to rotate enough that he could exit. Watson held the aircraft steady, watching the altimeter unwind, feeling the control column require more and more pressure as the wing structure weakened. Finally, McKinnon got the turret rotated. He crawled forward, grabbed his parachute, and moved to the rear escape hatch. He paused there for a moment, looking forward toward the cockpit where Watson sat silhouetted against the flames. Then McKinnon jumped. Watson was alone in the aircraft. The Lancaster continued its descent through 12,000 feet. The fire had spread along the entire wing, flames now visible from wingtip to fuselage. The wing root was beginning to fail, metal components separating as the heat exceeded their repairer, structural limits. Watson had perhaps 30 seconds before catastrophic failure. He did not attempt to reach an escape hatch. The aircraft would become uncontrollable the moment he released the control column. Instead, he maintained his grip, kept the wings as level as possible, and flew the Lancaster down toward the forests of Alsace. From the ground below, French civilians watched the burning bomber spiral slowly through the night sky, a bright torch descending toward the earth. The Lancaster struck a field near the village of Saint-Hippolyte at approximately 12:45 hours on April 28, 1944. The impact killed Flight Lieutenant James Andrew Watson instantly. He was 21 years old. He had been in command of an aircraft for exactly 2 months and 7 days. His decision to remain at the controls had given 6 men time to escape. All 6 survived the bailout, though they were captured and spent the remainder of the war in prisoner of war camps. The 6 men who escaped from Watson's burning Lancaster came down, scattered across the Alsace countryside. Flying Officer Ransom, the navigator, landed in a field and immediately attempted to evade capture. He buried his parachute, oriented himself using the stars, and began moving west toward what he hoped were Allied lines. Within 12 hours, German troops found him. Pilot Officer McKee lasted slightly longer before capture. Flight Sergeant Eames came down near a small village where locals witnessed his landing. He was taken into custody by Wehrmacht soldiers within minutes. The 3 gunners faced similar fates. Turnbull, Hayes, and McKinnon all successfully parachuted to Earth, all attempted to evade, and all were captured within 24 hours. None were injured during bailout, a testament to Watson's success in keeping the aircraft stable during their escape. German authorities transported them to interrogation centers, then to prisoner of war camps where they would remain until liberation in April of 1945. In those camps, the survivors processed what had happened. McKinnon later reported that he had seen Watson still at the controls as he jumped from the rear escape hatch. The aircraft was a blazing mass in a steep dive. McKinnon stated he believed it impossible that Watson could have escaped. Ransom's account confirmed this assessment. After bailing out and releasing his parachute, Ransom watched the burning Lancaster continue its descent. He saw it strike the ground. There was no explosion, just impact. The aircraft was already largely destroyed by fire before it crashed. French civilians from Saint-Hippolyte reached the crash site shortly after impact. They found Watson's body in the cockpit, still strapped into his seat, his hands on the control column. The locals, despite the risk of German reprisal, gave him a proper burial. They marked the grave and remembered the location. This act of respect from French villagers toward Allied airmen demonstrated the complex humanity that persisted even in occupied territory during the war's darkest years. Watson's family in Hamilton received notification that he was missing in action in early May of 1944. The telegram provided no details beyond the fact that his aircraft had failed to return from operations. For months, his parents held hope that he might have survived, might be in a prisoner of war camp, might eventually return. Only after the war ended did they receive confirmation of his death. The circumstances emerged slowly through interviews with the surviving crew members who returned home in 1945. Those crew members never forgot what Watson had done. In 1946 and 1947, 5 of them submitted recommendations that Flight Lieutenant Watson be awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. They detailed his actions in written statements filed with military authorities. They described how he had maintained control of a burning, crippled aircraft to give them time to escape. They emphasized that his sacrifice was deliberate, that he had chosen to remain at the controls knowing he would die. The Victoria Cross recommendations were denied. Military authorities determined that Watson's actions, while heroic, did not meet the specific criteria established for Britain's highest award for valour. Instead, he received a mention in dispatches, a lesser recognition that noted exceptional service but carried no medal or significant ceremony. This decision frustrated the surviving crew members who believed their pilot deserved the highest possible recognition. But the bureaucratic evaluation of Watson's sacrifice did not diminish what he had actually accomplished. The broader context of April 1944 helps explain both the frequency of such sacrifices and their limited recognition. Bomber Command flew 323 aircraft to Friedrichshafen that night. 18 Lancasters were lost, representing approximately 5.5% of the attacking force. This loss rate was considered acceptable by operational standards of the time. Each lost aircraft represented 7 men killed or missing. Across the month of April 1944, Bomber Command lost 247 aircraft in combat operations. That represented over 1,700 aircrew killed, missing, or captured. Within this brutal calculus, individual acts of heroism became statistically inevitable. Not every pilot faced Watson's specific situation, but many faced similar decisions. Stay with a crippled aircraft to give the crew time to escape, or abandon immediately and hope everyone gets out. The decisions made in those moments reflected individual character, but they also reflected the training and culture that Bomber Command had developed over years of operations. Watson's story was not unique in its broad outline. Other pilots made similar choices during the bomber offensive. What made each story significant was not its uniqueness, but its particularity. The specific details of how Watson maintained control, how long he flew the burning Lancaster, how his crew escaped, and how he died, created a narrative that his surviving crew members could remember and share. Those details transformed an abstract concept of duty and sacrifice into something concrete, something they had witnessed, something that had saved their lives. The crew members returned to civilian life carrying this knowledge. Ron Hayes, the mid-upper gunner, eventually settled in Canada. He maintained contact with other survivors, particularly with members of Watson's family. In 2004, 60 years after the event, French historians Gerard and Alban Bagui began researching the Lancaster crash near Saint-Hippolyte. They located the crash site, interviewed elderly villagers who remembered that night, and eventually made contact with surviving crew members and Watson's relatives. This research culminated in a memorial dedication on May 8, 2009, in Saint-Hippolyte. The ceremony brought together Watson's 2 nieces, Roy Eames and members of his family, and 5 members of the Hayes family. The French community honoured Watson's memory with a permanent monument marking the location where his aircraft crashed. During the ceremony, local historians described that night in April of 1944, how villagers had watched the burning Lancaster twist through the valley, how it had avoided the town, how it had finally crashed in an open field. The mathematical reality of Watson's sacrifice becomes clear when examining what his decision preserved. Each of the 6 crew members who escaped represented approximately 18 months of training at considerable expense. Navigator training alone required 9 months of specialized instruction. Wireless operators trained for 6 months. Gunners required 4 months of gunnery school after completing basic training. The total investment in training a complete Lancaster crew exceeded 2 years of instruction across multiple facilities in Canada, Britain, and other Commonwealth nations. But the mathematics extended beyond training costs. The 6 survivors represented future operational capacity. Had they died with Watson, the Royal Air Force would have needed to train 6 replacement crew members to maintain the same operational strength. Those replacements would have lacked combat experience, making them more vulnerable during their initial missions. The survival rate for new crews was significantly lower than for experienced crews. Watson's sacrifice thus created a ripple effect, preserving experienced airmen who could fly additional missions with replacement pilots and who could mentor newer crews. Ron Hayes, the mid-upper gunner, flew additional operations after being liberated from prisoner of war camp. Flight engineer Eames returned to service and completed more missions. While their captivity removed them from combat operations for nearly a year, they returned with experience that proved valuable during the final months of the war in Europe. Their survival meant that Watson's final mission, while it cost him his life, ultimately contributed to the broader war effort through the preservation of trained personnel. The broader strategic context of April 1944 illuminates why individual sacrifices like Watson's mattered. The Allied air campaign was designed to destroy Germany's industrial capacity, disrupt transportation networks, and draw Luftwaffe fighters into battles of attrition. Every bomber that reached its target and dropped its ordnance contributed to these objectives. Every crew that survived to fly again represented sustained pressure on German defences. The cumulative effect of thousands of missions, many of them involving individual acts of heroism that never received formal recognition, gradually eroded Germany's ability to wage industrial war. Watson's Lancaster never reached Friedrichshafen. His bombs never fell on the target. By the narrow measure of mission completion, his final flight was a failure. But by the broader measure of preserving trained personnel who could continue fighting, his sacrifice was strategically valuable. This tension between individual mission success and broader operational effectiveness characterized the entire strategic bombing campaign. Not every mission succeeded, not every aircraft returned, but the sustained campaign eventually achieved its objectives through cumulative pressure that no single mission could provide. The decision to remain at the controls of a burning aircraft represented a specific type of courage that the bomber offensive demanded repeatedly. It was not the courage of aggressive action, of attacking despite danger. It was the courage of acceptance, of remaining in a situation that offered no survival while others escaped. This, the passive form of heroism, received less public attention than fighter aces or successful bombing raids, but it was no less significant to the men whose lives it saved. The crew members who survived because of Watson's decision carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. They named children after him. They visited his grave. They attended memorial ceremonies decades later. Their gratitude was not abstract. They understood with absolute clarity that their survival, their families, their entire post-war lives existed because one man had chosen to die so they could live. This knowledge shaped how they remembered the war and how they spoke about their experiences. The French community that witnessed Watson's sacrifice and buried his body also carried this memory forward. The villagers who marked his grave in 1944 maintained that knowledge through the war years and the decades that followed. When researchers came looking for information 60 years later, elderly villagers still remembered the night the burning bomber came down. They could point to the field where it crashed. They could describe the sounds, the flames, the impact. This preservation of memory across generations transformed Watson's death from a military statistic into a human story that maintained meaning long after the strategic circumstances that prompted it had faded. The memorial dedication in 2009 brought together these various threads of memory. Watson's relatives, who had grown up knowing their uncle had died in the war, but perhaps not understanding the specific circumstances. The surviving crew members and their families, who had lived their entire adult lives knowing they owed their existence to Watson's sacrifice. The French villagers and their descendants, who had witnessed the event and maintained the memory through their community. All gathered at a small monument in Alsace to honour a decision made in approximately 90 seconds on a night in April of 1944. The altimeter read 17,000 feet when the first shell struck. By the time Flight Lieutenant James Andrew Watson died at the controls of his burning Lancaster, that altitude had decreased to 0. The vertical distance measured the aircraft's descent. The moral distance measured something else entirely, the gap between what duty required and what one man chose to give. Watson's crew believed their Lancaster was a capable aircraft that would protect them and bring them home. They believed their training had prepared them for combat operations. They believed the mission to Friedrichshafen was important enough to justify the risks. All of these beliefs were reasonable based on the information available to them and the doctrine they had been taught. What they could not know in advance was whether their pilot would stay with a dying aircraft long enough for them to escape. That question was answered in the specific actions of one night above France. Watson flew the burning bomber for as long as physics permitted. He maintained control through sideslips and constant pressure on the control column. He gave his navigator time to calculate position. He gave his crew time to collect parachutes and move to escape hatches. He gave McKinnon time to fight his jammed turret and crawl forward. And when the last man had jumped, Watson continued flying until structural failure made further control impossible. The collision between belief and reality that night was not about the Lancaster's capabilities or the mission's strategic value. It was about the price of preserving trained personnel in industrial warfare. Watson understood that price and paid it willingly. His crew members, descending through the darkness under parachute canopies, understood that they lived because he had died. The mathematical equation was absolute. 1 life exchanged for 6. No ambiguity, no uncertainty, no possibility of alternate outcome. The French villagers who witnessed the burning bomber's descent saw the same mathematical reality from a different perspective. They watched an aircraft that could have crashed into their homes instead crash in an open field. They saw a pilot who maintained enough control to avoid populated areas even as his aircraft disintegrated around him. Their gratitude expressed itself in a proper burial and a maintained grave, small gestures that honored the sacrifice that had preserved their village from additional destruction. The legacy of Watson's final mission extends beyond the 6 men who survived or the families they raised. It illuminates the specific type of heroism that industrial warfare demanded from bomber crews. Not every mission required such ultimate sacrifice. Most crews completed their operational tours and returned to civilian life. But enough missions ended with pilots facing Watson's choice that his story represents a pattern rather than an anomaly. The bomber offensive was built on the accumulated decisions of thousands of aircrew members who, when confronted with impossible situations, chose to prioritize their crew's survival over their own. This pattern received limited formal recognition because it was so common that acknowledging every instance would have been administratively impossible. The Victoria Cross recommendations for Watson were denied, not because his actions were insufficiently heroic, but because hundreds of other pilots had made similar choices. If every pilot who stayed with a burning aircraft to give his crew time to escape received the highest award for valor, the award would lose its meaning. The bureaucratic logic was sound, but missed the essential point. The frequency of such sacrifices did not diminish their significance. It magnified it. The mission to Friedrichshafen on April 27th and 28th, 1944, achieved its tactical objectives. Bombs fell on target. Damage was inflicted on German industrial facilities. 18 aircraft were lost, representing acceptable losses by the standards of strategic bombing doctrine. The mission report noted these facts without dwelling on individual stories. Watson's Lancaster was recorded as lost over France due to enemy action. The 6 survivors were listed as prisoners of war. Watson himself was listed as killed in action. These administrative notations captured the facts while missing the meaning. The meaning emerged only in the specific recollections of the men who were there. McKinnon, looking forward from the rear escape hatch and seeing Watson still at the controls. Ransom watching the burning aircraft descend after he had parachuted to safety. Eames understanding in the cockpit what Watson intended to do and being unable to change that intention. These memories, carried forward across decades and shared with family members and historians, transformed a tactical loss into a human story about choice under impossible circumstances. 75 years. After Watson died, his sacrifice remains meaningful because it illuminates fundamental truths about duty, leadership, and the price of industrial warfare. The bomber offensive required sustained operations that inflicted heavy casualties on aircrew members. Maintaining operational strength required preserving trained personnel whenever possible. Individual pilots made decisions that converted their own deaths into their crew's survival. These decisions were not recorded in mission reports or strategic assessments, but they were essential to the campaign's success. Watson's 2 minutes at the controls of a burning Lancaster determined the fate of 6 men and, by extension, the 3 generations of families they raised after the war. That brief span of time encapsulates what courage meant in the context of strategic bombing, not aggressive action against the enemy, but passive acceptance of death to preserve others. Not glory or recognition, but simple fulfillment of duty in a situation that offered no escape. The memorial at St. Hippolyte stands as physical testament to this story. The monument marks where Watson's Lancaster struck the earth, where he died maintaining control to the last moment, where French villagers found his body and gave him respect despite the circumstances of occupation and war. Visitors to that memorial learn the specific details of one night in April of 1944, but they also learn something broader about the nature of sacrifice in industrial warfare. The 6 men who survived never forgot. Their gratitude expressed itself in Victoria Cross recommendations, in maintained contact with Watson's family, in attendance at memorial ceremonies decades later, in stories told to children and grandchildren. This transmission of memory across generations ensures that Watson's sacrifice retains meaning long after the strategic circumstances that prompted it have been resolved. Flight Lieutenant James Andrew Watson was 21 years old, and when he died. He had been operational for 2 months. He had completed 15 missions successfully and was halfway through his 16th when the Junkers 88 found his Lancaster. In the 90 seconds between the order to abandon aircraft and his death, he made a choice that defined his life and preserved 6 others. That choice, multiplied across thousands of similar instances during the bomber offensive, represented the human foundation of strategic air power in World War II. The mathematics were brutal, 1 life for 6, but the mathematics were also absolute. Without Watson's sacrifice, 6 trained aircrew members would have died in a spinning, burning aircraft over occupied France. With his sacrifice, they lived, were captured, survived imprisonment, returned home, and built lives that extended across 75 years and 3 generations. The equation balanced exactly, offering no ambiguity about cause and effect. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.